Hello and welcome back. This is what you've all been waiting for. This is the 24-25 full draft strategy video, and in this one, I'll encapsulate all of my off-season work into one set of tips, principles, and strategic advantages that you can find, and we'll go over a lot more. We've got a lot to cover in this one, so let's jump right in. Now, if you're new here, this strategy video is a summary of previous analysis that I've done on this channel, including the defenseman strategy video, the goalie strategy video, last season's strategy video, which will be tweaked a little bit this year, but it serves as a good base of knowledge, and then this year's look at positional scarcity. But before we get into specifics, let's start with the basics, and the most essential part of any draft strategy is to know your league settings. I can't stress that enough. Now, you obviously want to know your point weighting. We'll get to that in a second, but you also want to know how many bench spots you have, how many IR plus spots you have, so you know whether or not you can stash injured players in your draft or not. And if you have fewer IR plus, you may not want to rely on streaming players week to week because you don't have those extra spots to stash your injured players. It'll be difficult to roster a full roster every week. So that's very important when it comes to managing the total game volume week to week that you can potentially use, especially in a categories league where you're going to want that volume. But in addition to that, you obviously have to know what your point weightings are so that you know which point weightings are higher than others and you can focus on those in your draft. If you don't know how the points are being awarded in your league, it's kind of like fighting with one arm tied behind your back. You have to know where the value lies in your league in order to exploit it. Now, once you do know your league settings and your point weighting, you can head on over to the custom rating tool on the Patreon link in the description below, where you can input those point weightings and get a custom scatter plot and list that you can use to draft off of. This is the custom rating tool off of the Data Draft Patreon that you can find in the link in the description. This is just using the default Yahoo point weighting, but it gives you a customized scatter plot so you can visually see the difference between certain players. You can compare players by filtering them out and then adding them back in with this here. You can unselect all, add one or two players at a time and compare them individually, or you can just work off of this individual list that is tailored to your league format. Now, if you want to be able to use this during your draft, you also have the ability to download this information and use it in Excel. So this is essentially a draft sheet that you can use kind of the way that you've always used draft sheets. So you can find this in the Patreon link in the description below. But what if you're in a categories league? For most categories leagues, offense wins championships. Most of these leagues have more offensive categories or peripheral categories than goaltending ones. And that means that you should focus on building the best offensive peripheral coverage team and kind of fade the rest. So aim for more complete elite top level picks, guys like Brady Tkachuk, Matthew Tkachuk, guys who hit and block shots. JT Miller is an excellent category coverage player that you can find earlier in your draft. But you also still probably want an elite G1, and we'll get to that in the goaltending section of this video, and you can find it in the goaltending video. The list of elite G1s is about 9 to 11 players deep. And you're going to want to draft the last one available on the board. So that's going to give you the best value in terms of ADP, and you're still going to get a reliable starting goaltender who's going to give you that games played volume and that elite performance that you're looking for. You're also going to want to corner the market on 2 or 3 different categories. So what I like to do is pick a theme and stick with it through each pick in the draft. I prefer goals, shots, and hits because a lot of those are scarce in terms of players that you can find on the waiver wire or players that you can find elite level players. It's very easy to find assist heavy power play merchants. It's very difficult to find those 4 to 5 or even 3.5 to 5 shot per game guys who are also 45 to 60 goal pace. Those are very difficult to find. That's why you have to draft them early, but you also want to keep that in mind as you move further along in your draft and find those values later in your draft. Guys who are above 3 shots per game that are being drafted, after the 100th ADP mark or anything like that could potentially help you. But if you want to amplify your team's performance, you pick a couple of categories and stick with it. Now, you can use this in points leagues if you know which point values are giving you the most value. So if game-winning goals or shutouts are weighed heavier in your league, you can keep that in mind and try to target goaltenders that give you shutouts that are obviously going to be on a good team. Guys like Jacob Markstrom have been historically good for shutouts. Tristan Jarry is a depth guy that you can get. He's usually good for shutouts. And then game-winning goals, guys like Nate Chess, etc. Those are guys who you can target later in your draft to kind of stick with that theme and keep that going throughout your entire draft. Now, I do want to take this time to mention that I have a data draft collection form in the description below. This is going to help out to create custom tailored strategies for each league format. So what I've done is I've put together a form. After your draft, go down to the link in the description below, fill out where you drafted each player, and we'll take that all that data, and next year we'll be able to custom tailor draft strategies based on all of your inputs. This is really going to help the channel. It's really going to help you guys in terms of figuring out what strategy actually works best. I'm giving you my best guess through all the analysis that I've done over the last 2.5 years, but this is going to give you actual data-driven decision-making points that you can use going forward. So please head to the description below and fill out that Google form after you've drafted your league. Now let's get back to the strategy. The number one rule is to fade goalies. Now this has gotten more amplified over the years. So initially I said don't draft a goalie in the first round. Then the next year it was don't draft a goalie in the first couple of rounds. Now it's basically you should fade goalies in general. So this was a look at our goalie video that I did. This is showing you the guys whose ADP versus end rank, at the end rank, there was way lower than the ADP. So you can see Sorokin, he was disappointing. Vasilevsky, Ottinger, Ullmark, Georgiev, Gustafsson, all these guys in the 7th, 8th round range. These were very disappointing goaltenders. And you can see a trend. So the guys taken after the 9th round, they're still a little bit disappointing, but only 52.6% of those guys were disappointing. Compared that to about 66.6% of the goalies taken before that point in the 9th round. So that's where you're going to want to push goaltending back. And if you're in a points league, you definitely want to try to use that 0G strategy. So points leagues, if you're using that 0G, you target goalies after the 9th round. It's better if you can push them back a little bit further into the 10th, 11th, 12th round range. I went over in the goalie video that Nate from Apples and Genos won the Fantasy Puck Creators League, and he didn't draft a goalie until at least the 12th round, and he didn't end up keeping any of his goalies that he drafted. All of the goalies he drafted, he picked up at various points throughout the season. So that's a testament to how good the 0G strategy works in points leagues. But the guys that you're going to want to target should be on good defensive teams. That's going to insulate your goaltender a lot. The shots that he is facing are going to be lower danger and easier to stop. And then you're also going to want to monitor the waiver wire during the year and look for injuries, look for backups or 1Bs that take over the net, find value wherever you can find it on the waiver wire, but you're going to have to scan the waiver wire in order to find those goalies. You can't just draft 2 elite level goaltenders and forget about it for the rest of the year. That's the one thing that you do have to do if you're using the 0G strategy. If you're in a category league, you still want to use that last elite G1 strategy, essentially taking the best value ADP guy in that top tier list. So you can visit the goaltending video for a full list on who those guys are, but essentially you want one of those guys that's going to be very reliable and consistent, but you want him at the best value possible. And then you grab your G2 around the 11th, 12th round range, or even further back if you can. But that, again, must be on a good defensive team. I can't stress that enough. You don't want to pick a guy, unless you're in a points league with total saves as a category that's getting heavily weighted. Then you could potentially go for a guy like Mrazek or John Gibson, who's getting shelled every night for 35 plus shots. But otherwise, you want to insulate your goaltending and give yourself the best chance to put up a decent save percentage, goals against, to get some shutouts every now and then. And obviously, those wins are going to come from good defensive teams as well. Now, the next rule is to definitely pick 2 elite power play quarterback D, sometimes 3. So as we mentioned before, offense wins championships, and that kind of goes for every league format. But if you use those 2 elite power play quarterbacks, that will boost your offense. And these are guys that are very rare. There's only 3 or 5, 3, 4, 5 guys each year that are close to or at a point per game average who get those the shot volume that you need, the power play points that you need, the goal scoring that you need. Those are very rare features in a defenseman. You can find guys who get assists, even power play assists are relatively easy to find. You can get hits and blocks guys later on, but those elite offensive metrics are hard to find. So if you corner the market on those elite power play quarterback D, it's going to be very difficult for other teams to match up against you, because you're going to have that elite offense because you're picking those guys in the top and you're not drafting a goalie, but you're also adding that additional bonus because of those defensemen that you're drafting. Now, if you're in a points league, your D3 should be used for a guy who's another power play quarterback, whether that's a solo guy on a relatively bad team, maybe like a Seth Jones or Brock Faber, something like that. Not that they're a bad team, but a guy who's in that ADP range, in that 9th to 11th round range, you can potentially find a solo power play quarterback who's not being challenged by anybody else on his team. But at the very least, you want to make sure you're getting a timeshare power play quarterback. Maybe a Shea Theodore, Alex Petrangelo, Noah Hannafin. One of those 3 guys could potentially be the power play quarterback. And we went over a lot of that in the defensive strategy video. For your bangers leagues, if you're in a hits and blocks heavy league, this is where I would potentially reach and grab that elite level hits and blocks D somewhat early, but try to get a hits and blocks D with some offensive upside if possible. The number one guy that comes to mind when I think of that is Mackenzie Weegar. He puts up over 2.5 hits and over 2.5 blocks per game, and he scored 20 goals last year. If you can find that, 90 ADP and beyond, that's going to add some intense value for your categories league where you're getting points for those hits and blocks, and you're also going to get some goals on top of that. If you can't get that offensive punch, you go for a guy like Darnell Nurse or Jacob Trouba. We mentioned a lot of those guys in the defensive video, so I'm not going to cover all of them here, but we will take a quick look at this list. So what this showed us in the defensive video is that basically after that 9th round range, there's a lot of disappointment. There's a couple of guys that are value, and basically all of the guys who are improved or relatively similar in that range above the 9th round are guys who are solo power play quarterbacks. You also have Noah Dobson here. He was a power play quarterback. Doughty was the power play quarterback. It'll be interesting to see if he is this year. Letang was a peripherals guy with a little bit of offensive upside. Morgan Riley was a power play quarterback. But then as you get down here, you start to get into the timeshares. Chikrin, Hannafin, Dursey, Pionk, Matheson. Ekholm's not. Sanderson shared some time on the power play, but pretty much everybody else was either a hits and blocks specialist or was relatively disappointing. So this is something to keep in mind as you're drafting your D. So again, if you want more clarification, head on over to the defensive strategy video where I covered this in great detail. Now, up next, we have to talk about risk management. So as I've done a number of analysis on this channel, you cannot afford to swing and miss in the first 5 or 6 rounds of your draft. It's very difficult to find a player on the waiver wire who can replace that 1.2 plus point per game ceiling that you get from those guys in those top round ranges. So it's very difficult to find that and replace that. If you lose it, if a guy gets injured, there's really not much you can do about it. But if he's not injured, if he's in your lineup and you have to roster him, you're wasting a roster spot on a guy who's disappointing, and that could kill your entire season. So one of the things that I did, this was from 22-23, looking at whether or not players were relatively similar, disappointing, or improved based on their ADP and end rank. And 54.23% of the players taken in the first 6 rounds were relatively disappointing. Now, while almost, it's very difficult to become improved in that range because obviously you're being taken very high, so you have to keep up a high level of play to improve on that level. The fact is there were a couple guys who improved on their first round rating, which is crazy. But as you start to go through this, you get a lot more disappointment. But the other thing to take note here, almost 70% of the goalies taken in the first 6 rounds this year were very disappointing, hence the need to fade goalies. So that's why we reduce risk in this range of the draft, because we don't want to draft a guy who's going to end up disappointing based on their ADP. We want those guys to hold up their end of the bargain because we're spending a high amount of draft capital to draft these guys on our team. We're expecting a lot of results. The other thing I want to mention is don't draft rookies in general. The last 2 rounds or so is probably a safe place to take all that risk and put it there. But rookies are almost never reliable fantasy players for the entire season. And more often than not, if a rookie does have a really good fantasy season, you can find them on the waiver wire some point early in the season. So I've almost never seen a rookie that's been drafted that stayed on the player's team the entire year. Even last year, because Bedard got hurt in one of my leagues, he got dropped to the waiver wire, which was nuts. But at the same time, those are the outlier players, the McDavids, the Bedards, etc. There's not many of them. I don't know if Celebrini is going to be in that category this year. So I'm pretty much just fading rookies all throughout the draft. I don't like to draft them. But if you do want to draft them, and if you're in a keepers league and you want to draft them, that's completely different. But if you do want to draft rookies, try to do it later in the draft where it's not going to burn you. If you have to drop them, you can pick up somebody else on the waiver wire. Now, with all of that said, let's do a 9th round check-in. So by that 9th round, This is the spot where those D kind of get a little bit more disappointing. And this is the part of the draft where you may want to start targeting goaltenders. So what should you have on your roster by that point? So in the first and second round, you want to go for best player available, kind of regardless of position. If there's a tiebreaker between two players, the multi-position player is going to be the tiebreaker there. Draisaitl, Jack Hughes, Matthew Tkachuk, these guys are dual position eligible. That is very valuable. There are very few of those players who are at a 40-goal pace throughout the course of the season. So anybody who's a 40-goal pace guy and dual eligible is going to be a little bit more valuable, but you do want to draft for that upside, that ceiling, because you cannot find that later on in the draft and you can't find it on the waiver wire. So 1.2 point per game ceiling or above, 50-goal pace or 50-goal capability, and then a proven track record spanning back multiple seasons. And that's why I use 3-year averages, because obviously a player can go off and have a career season. Remember, a couple years ago, Chris Kreider had a 50-goal a year, but what is he actually doing? Because he's not going to back up that 50-goal season with another one, but he is a 35 to 40-goal guy. So that is kind of where he falls in terms of his 3-year average, and that's a better predictor of what he's going to do this season. Now, once you have those best players available in the first and second round, you could even maybe take that to the third round, depending on how your draft plays out. But within the third round to the ninth round range, or even the second round if you're going to get one of those elite defensemen, but you want to grab your 2 power play quarterbacks, and you want to get them, obviously the guys who are quarterbacking those elite level power plays are going to be, more valuable. Guys like Makar, guys like Adam Fox, guys like Quinn Hughes. Those are guys that are getting a ton of power play points. Evan Bouchard stepped up last year and was immediately valuable for you if you drafted him last year. So you want to make sure you have at least those 2 elite power play quarterback defensemen. If you're in a points league and you don't have hits or blocks as a category, or you're very power play heavy, you might want to grab that third defenseman for that points league, and you definitely want him to be a power play quarterback as well. Now, you should also be fading goalies unless you're in that category league and you get that last elite G1. But otherwise, you push them back to around the 10th round or beyond. The further back you can push them, the better. The last thing I want to mention is finding value by using positional scarcity. So when other teams start filling out positional need, and that usually happens towards the 6th round plus range, as guys stop taking best player available, you'll find that really good players are still on the board well after they should have already been taken, because guys are starting to draft for position. So you can go in and scoop up that value if you've already filled those positions of need, and one of those is defensemen. The other is elite goal-scoring wingers. Typically, those are very scarce. But even now, lately, the goal-scoring centers, the guys like Braden Point, the guys like, obviously, McDavid, Draisaitl, McKinnon, Matthews, all of those guys are very scarce as well because of the pace that they can put up, 60-goal pace. But obviously, you're going to want to grab those very rare positional scarcity guys that are very hard to find on the waiver wire or deeper in the draft. That will unlock a lot of value throughout the rest of your draft. So I've talked a lot about the earlier rounds because they are very important, but what do you do with the later rounds of your draft? Now, if you're doing some of the stuff that we've talked about earlier, you're going to grab your goaltending here, you're going to grab your D4 here, but in addition to that, what should you be looking for? So what I like to look for is, first and foremost, guys who have an elite ceiling but are potential injury risks. So guys like Val Nichushkin only played in 68.7% of his team's games over the last 3 seasons, but when he's in there, he's elite level. Point per game, half a goal per game. That's about a 42, 43 goal pace. You've got really decent shot volume, 2.93, and really good power play numbers, and he hits on top of that. He's just enigmatic. He's always in and out of the lineup, and it's not necessarily just injury risk because there's been some behavioral issues later on, but that ADP is a little bit old. He's been climbing up a little bit, so I would reach a little bit to grab him because he's basically a top 10 round kind of player, or even maybe a top 5 round kind of player when he's healthy. And this is the kind of value you can find. You can also get a guy like Evander Kane. He's injury prone. He's been trending downward, unfortunately, but his hits volume is elite level, kind of like that Tom Wilson hits and goal scoring guy with some shot volume. Speaking of Tom Wilson, he's probably going to be available for you there if you're in a bangers league and you want those hits, some shots. He was a 25 goal guy at various points in his career. It'll be interesting to see if they have a little bit better offense this year, but he's also had a little bit of trouble staying healthy. But you can also find these really depth centers that nobody seems to get, any love towards. Nazem Kadri is one of these guys that's always drafted in this range. 3.38 shots per game last year. Really good power play numbers, good offensive metrics across the board, just no hits or blocks there. So you're getting a guy who's really good in 4 categories, 5 categories, but maybe not elite in those categories and not as complete. Same type of thing with Bo Horvat. You can find guys like this on this level, 133, 148. That's around the 11th or 12th round range in a 12-team league. You can usually find this value late, which is why we fade centers. So unless you're getting one of those elite guys like McDavid or Matthews or McKinnon, then you want to fade those centers and potentially pick them up in this range. Now, I do want to just quickly shout out Frank Vetrano. He is due for regression just based on the fact that he rocketed up to this 71 range last season. Excellent goal scoring volume, 37 goals last year, 3.32 shots per game, and he gets some hits as well. So quickly want to shout him out. But look at where John Tavares has fallen. 110 ADP. He was a guy that was consistently around a 40-goal pace. He's dropped off a little bit in the last couple of years. He's down to a .81 point per game, but the shot volume is nice. These are the kind of players that you want to target. Maybe the older players who people think have fallen off, who have a little bit less name value. You can also find some younger players, guys with upside that haven't necessarily broken out yet. Dylan Guenther was on a breakout list that I made in the offseason. He just signed a massive deal. That's a little bit high for my taste, but he is very promising and up and coming. .78 point per game. His goal pace is really good. That's around a mid-30s goal pace. Shot volume is good, and he does it on the power play as well. You can find that late. Jordan Kyrou, dual eligible. He's really consistent with his shot volume. He's on a power play on one of those lower teams that you can find. And, again, the goal pace is pretty good there. Probably low 30s goal pace. And then you're also looking at guys like Nate Jess. He's good for game winners. He's good for shot volume. Hasn't really broken out for that major offensive season. So you're in this range, you're getting one of a couple of things. You're either getting guys who are injury prone, guys who are banged up that you may not have in your lineup all the time, or you're getting guys who are potential, elite level in 1 or 2 categories. That let's take a look at Kyle Palmieri, for example. He's going to be good for goals and shot volume and a little bit of power play. So 3 categories you're mainly getting out of him. Not good for assists or total points. Gets a couple of hits, but nothing crazy there. You're getting these guys who are 1 or 2 category guys that are elite level in those categories, or you're finding guys that are relatively complete. Now, there's a couple of them on the board. We can talk about Mark Stone. He's another injury risk guy. 55% of his team's games over the last couple of years, but almost a point per game average. Really good assist numbers, get some power play time, etc. Jared McCann is a goal-scoring center left wing. He's always very valuable for the goal totals and the shot volume. But in terms of complete guys, you're looking at a guy like Boone Jenner. So this is a guy who's never going to pop off for that elite level offensive season, but he's always really good with the hits and blocks. So if you're in a categories league, you would look at guys like this. If you're in a points league, you're going to look at guys that match whatever theme you're setting up for your picks. So if it's goals, if it's shots, if it's game winners, if it's whatever it is, find those guys in this range of the draft. This is where you can take on some risk and find some value. Now, for your deep league players, this is where I would potentially look at guys who are kind of hyped up that could potentially come out of nowhere and make an impact this year. Guys like Stankoven, younger players are typically good for this because there's not a proven track record on them. Guys like Kurashev, who I mentioned in the Breakouts series over the offseason. This is where you start to take risk. Huberdeau on a bounce back. I mean, he's severely discounted. He wasn't ranked when I put together these ADPs, and not a lot of shot volume, not a lot of offensive production, but, obviously he's been as high as a 72, so you're betting on upside. That's what I would do in these deep leagues where you're looking for value. Now, there is one other element to this strategy that I do want to touch on briefly. It's not my forte, admittedly, but that's why I turned to my buddy Spencer for a little bit of advice, and that is the playoff schedule. This is kind of a bonus if you want to look at it before your draft. Now, I would use this mainly as a tiebreaker between 2 players. I wouldn't use it deeper in the draft, but especially for the top end guys, if you want to find those guys who are going to be there for you in your championship week, go to your league settings, find out which weeks your playoffs are, and then try to find which teams have the most light night games in that stretch. Now, your elite level players are going to be in your lineup no matter what. The kind of middle of the pack guys, the 3rd to 9th round range guys, those are the guys that you might want to use this for. So week 22, March 17th to the 23rd, there's only one game Monday, 3 games Wednesday. You've got 4 games Friday. Sunday's a little bit heavier, but the teams with 4 games, you got Boston, Buffalo, Chicago, Dallas, Edmonton, Florida, Kings, Preds, Penguins, Kraken, Leafs, Vancouver, Winnipeg. And of those teams, the off-night teams, Chicago, Dallas, Florida, and Seattle, 2 off nights for those guys, but Chicago with 3 off nights. So that could make or break just maybe one of your picks where you're determining between 1 or 2 players. You can take a look at weeks 23. You've got a couple more games on Monday night, only 2 on Wednesday. You've got 5 on Friday, 5 on Sunday, so a pretty decent split, but Wednesday is the lighter night. And then you've got Anaheim, Colorado, Florida, and Dallas with 2 off-night games, and you can see them here. Week 24, March 31st to April 6th. Again, a pretty decent split. Monday's got 4, Wednesday's got 5, Friday's got 3. That's a light night, and then Sunday has 8 games, so you're going to be able to find some stuff on the waiver wire for that Sunday game. That could be your championship if you put your final week as week 24. And obviously the key teams for this week, Minnesota with 4 off nights. So a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, perfect schedule. That could make or break whether or not you go with a guy like Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, Boldy, etc. Chicago with 3 off nights. They're popping up again. We saw them earlier. Florida with 2 off nights. Colorado with 2 off nights. So that's something to take a note of. Now, I would advocate not having your playoffs week 25 if you're in charge of your league settings, because every year, like clockwork, teams rest their top players in that range, and you end up with losing a championship because a team sat your best player. That happened to me last year with a number of the Boston players. It happened to me a couple times with Boston guys. So you want to avoid that by not having your playoffs in the last week of the season. But if you have them, Monday, only 2 games. That's really light. And then Friday, 3 games. That's really light as well. Very heavy Saturday, very, relatively heavy Tuesday and Thursday. So that's usually the split in terms of weekly production. You're going to get Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, very heavy. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, usually light. And this is the case in this particular week. You've got teams with 4 games, Colorado, Florida, Minnesota, Nashville, Washington. Minnesota, again, 4 off nights. Florida with 3, Colorado with 2. So some of the best teams to target for the fantasy playoffs: Minnesota, Florida, Colorado, Dallas, Chicago. Those are going to be some teams that you're going to want to grab some guys from. And just to make a note of this, this is using the Data Draft Fantasy Hockey AI ChatGPT tool. So if you have a ChatGPT subscription, you can use this for free. I have uploaded it with current 24-25 data, including the schedule, and you can ask this questions as if you were asking me and get kind of a better answer in terms of the data, maybe a little bit worse in terms of the fact that you have to wrangle some AI to give you the insights that you need compared to a person. But this is available for free if you have a ChatGPT subscription. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you got something out of it. I hope I've helped you guys plan out your draft. Going in with a plan and a strategy is better off than not going in with a plan or a strategy. So hopefully this does provide you some value. If it does, leave me a comment in the comment section below. As always, I'll see you in the next one. Good luck with all of your drafts.